Live streaming is on.
Guess everybody got that word.
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right. Welcome,
If
everyone.
only Rusty were that loud and clear.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. It's December. So welcome to the December meeting of the Western North Carolina Linux Users Group. We don't have a specific topic defined. However, in the last minute, Rusty suggested something over the email that we could talk about. However, Rusty is not here, and I don't remember very specifically what that was. So we'll put a pin in that until he reappears. So I think we'll there's not a lot of us right now, at least. So I think we'll go around the room, and that should allow plenty of time for something a little more elaborate. Hey, Rusty.
There he is.
Rusty, if you can hear me, what was it that you said you wanted to talk about today?
Well, the thing I posted was about just some general discussion on what it is that a multi-boot pen drive is composed of. It seems to be a miniature version of a hard disk that has, multi-boot operating systems installed with a boot partition and some sort of a bootloader. But I constantly have to go back and try to understand what I'm doing if I use one of those things. I also discovered that I had thought there was a Linux version of a multi-boot pen drive tool, but it turns out that it seems like all the tools are Windows based. There is one called Ventoy that is an open source.
Oops.
Well, he's gone. That was rather abrupt. I wonder if he hit a button.
I think they transported him down to the planet.
Darth is at work again.
Well, he came back, but now he's Leander.
Hey, Leander.
Hello.
There you are.
I played around with multi-boot quite a while back, and it was open source, as I recall. And I put like some of the newer distros on there just to do a tryout, and some of them would multi-boot right up, and others would multi-boot to nothing. So
Yeah, I'm going to contradict what I said, and since we're already talking about it, let's just keep talking about it. When you say the tool, when you say it was multi-boot, was the tool to set it up open sourced, or was it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I downloaded it from I guess maybe Synaptic or something. It was for. I've been using Xubuntu, so it was maybe in there, maybe even in there. I don't know. I'll have to look.
Yeah. Well, if Rusty's not yet back, I just fear that as soon as I say this, he'll reappear. But I don't want to get too far into this if it's generally for Rusty's benefit and he's not here to benefit from it.
Yeah.
I kind of expect he'd pop back up.
Yep.
Hopefully he's fine. I don't see any mushroom clouds over his direction, so I think he'll be just fine. So yeah, let's go around the room. So Gene, what you got going on?
Oh, you caught me looking for multi-boot. I was up in the DC area for the past, this is all I'll say. My Ubuntu includes it as part of the packages. So anyway, yeah, I was up in DC and visiting the grandkids. So I'm pretty much, my brain is pretty much in
Fried.
12-year-old mode. So if I, if any of my humor is more sophomoric or scatological than it normally is, you'll just have to forgive me. But I was thinking the other day that it's been a while, it seems, in the Linux group since anybody has really had any, what I would call existential problems with it. And I'm wondering if that means that Linux has kind of evolved into a mature or semi-mature operating system where things just do work, which is what we've all always wanted, is you set it up and it just works. And I really haven't had any major complaints. I have noticed that it does crash probably more than it did in the past, but I'm going to attribute that to maybe some unwieldy so many programs being included. I don't know what caused Windows to crash other than faulty code writing, but I suspect it's all the same, probably the same thing, where the OSs grow and grow until they just get too big, too much stuff going on there, too much information to try to process. But I don't know. So yeah, I'd be curious to know what other people think about that. But other than that, and my 12-year-old brain, I've got nothing really.
Gene, my experience with Linux is a long time ago when I first started using Linux back in 94, 95, you had to work hard to get it to work. Now you have to work hard to crash it.
Yeah,
You really do.
I think my feeling is that way. I guess that's one of the benefits of the open source model is that when you send in a complaint or when you have a glitch, somebody gets in there and fixes it and mines the software until they get it right. And and I haven't heard much at all about any kind of hacking. I did see that, what was it? One of the KeyPass things, was it LastPass, had been hacked lately.
Really?
But that's not I don't think is that a Linux program? I think that's probably more of a Windows thing.
Platform. Of course.
Yeah.
Cross-platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't hear of much hacking going on in the way of Linux, and don't hear much of any real, honest to goodness, big problems with it. So I'm hoping that that's the case, that it's matured to where you just don't have those kind of problems.
Well, you said something, Gene, that made me think about something I've been thinking about, and that is you mentioned that Windows had millions of lines of code, whereas Linux doesn't have anywhere near that many. The thing about millions of lines of code is the more lines of code you have, the more vulnerable you can become. The threat posture is increased, or the risk is increased because of all vulnerabilities that are inherent in the code as you increase the number of lines.
Well, the guy that introduced me to computers in the beginning, always, he was a very nuts and bolts kind of guy, and he was all about, you know, like you say, in those days it was hard to get a system up and running, and once you got it up and running, you never wanted to let it go down because there was no guarantee you'd ever get the darn thing working again. But
Right.
you know, from those days to these days just seems like a real quantum leap. So
Nowadays, I've got Linux distros that have had uptime of over 365 days, over a year, never
Yeah.
shut down.
Wow, that's impressive.
so anyway, that's it for me, Brent.
All right, thanks, Gene. I realize I have muted myself. I'm breaking my own rules. Dan, what you got going on?
Well, this month has been kind of busy for me from a regular life standpoint. So I haven't had a lot of time to devote to technology. Alan and I have been pretty busy though, working on the website. We've decided we've had to move it. You guys say something? You want to say something, Brent, Gene? Or okay. Anyway, we've
I would like to
decided.
say something, but you finish.
Okay, we've decided that we've had to move it because where it was being self-hosted wasn't an issue per se, except with the SMTP portion of it or side of it, and that is that Spectrum Internet will not unblock port 25, and they've also blocked port 587. So there's no way around it. And so the communication interaction with creating accounts, I know Pete tried to create an account the last time, and pointed the fact that to me that there was an issue that I didn't see, and what I did was decided that let's get rid of it off of the self-host, and so I opened up a Linode server, virtual server with 1 gig of RAM, 25 gigs of storage, and 1 terabyte of transfer, and I created a Drupal instance on that. But I decided not to migrate the current site. I'm going to rebuild it from scratch, make it a little bit different from the approach I took. I'm also not going to include the multilingual interface because I found out that was not a problem, but it was a lot of work. And so I'm going to leave that off. And right now it is up and running. It is secure on the Linode server. And I do have backups implemented as well. And so I'm building it. That's what I'm doing right now is I'm building it. But as I said, I don't have a lot of time to devote to it right now because one thing that's happened is beginning of the month, my wife had to go into the hospital for her second neurosurgery. So she's had extensive back surgery. She's actually in bed right now. Been out of the hospital for like 3 weeks, but still in bed because of the back surgery. And so I've been attending to her needs, pretty much take all of her meals to her and that kind of thing. So I haven't had a lot of chance to do that. And secondly, my 15-year companion pet, my dog Ginger, passed away. And so I've got her remains now in an urn in the house. So I've got her, but not in the same state she was in before she died. So that's kind of made a draw on me as well. But as things start to level off, I'll get more time to devote to our website and that kind of thing. As far as any other Linux stuff I'm doing, that pretty much wraps up what I've been concentrating on. Alan has been very helpful, by the way, helping me with, this guy eats and sleeps and dreams Drupal, I think. And so he's a great resource for me to draw.
Really?
Yeah. And he's sending me stuff all the time. And so together we're building our site back, and it'll be there one day soon. And I'll let you guys take a look at it. You can go to it now. It's https not www, but WNCLinuxusersgroup.com, and it'll pull up, and you'll see what I've done so far. It's not much at all, but a little bit different look and feel than what it was before. I'm not sure if it'll pull up on www.wnc, but if it doesn't, I'll fix that. But anyway, that's all I got. You said, Gene, you had a question or something. You're muted, Gene.
I was just going to throw in that years and years ago, I built a website using Composer, the Composer with a K, Linux program, and it was a pain in the, you know what. And I finally got it working, but I think, to me at least, looking at what you guys were presenting last month, the biggest difference is that you don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of HTML and be monkeying around with that nearly as much as as you did with the old Composer. And it's more like a suite. It's all encompassing, whereas, you know, a lot of the things that I did that I would like to have done with Composer couldn't be done, but they could be done with Drupal, it seems. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, if you want to get in behind the scenes and get into HTML and CSS with Drupal, you certainly can do that, and I have done that with the website that I'm building now. So,
yeah.
But you're right. You don't have to rely on a knowledge of HTML and CSS to put it together.
All right, thanks, guys. Alan sort of got a name drop in there, so let's see what he's got going on.
Pretty much the only Linux activities have been working along with Dan on this Drupal website, and I've learned a lot about about the whole platform, but in particular using the mail feature. And as Dan said, the problem we encountered was that the internet host was blocking SMTP mail servers, and we actually got the website would receive mail and to send mail out, but certain mailbox providers, including my Earthlink account, my email provider, was subscribing to various spam block lists, and there's probably 6 or 8 block lists that for various types of spam. But the one that was giving us the problem is called a PBL, a policy block list, where an internet service provider publishes their policy that they don't allow SMTP mail services. So it was working on Gmail and other mailbox providers, but not on others. And in order to accommodate everybody, we had to have it have our mail dependably delivered. So that's why we had to move it. And I also got into SMT mail relay hosts, and of which Gmail offers a service, and I found another service called SendGrid, which was pretty impressive. It's a paid service. They give you like 100 free emails per day forever. But anyway, that's where we're at. We're now on Linode and hope to get that thing, the postfix mail service installed and working reliably. And that's what I've been doing.
Just to piggyback something Alan said, Linode does block port 25, does block port 587, does block port 453. That seems to be the general way to go these days because of spam. However, the main difference between Linode and Spectrum is that once you get out your DKIM, your SBF records and your MX records and your DMARC and everything set up appropriately to say that, hey, I'm not a spammer, we need this service for this particular purpose, and I've done everything I need to do, to prevent spam from being relayed through my web host. You can send a request in, actually a ticket to Linode, and with that explanation, and show them, demonstrate that you've set everything up appropriately, and they will accommodate you. That's not something Spectrum will do. On their policy, on their website, it says, don't even ask us to remove the blocks. We won't do it if you're a residential customer. So I do have a leg up in the Linode side, in that we hopefully will be able to convince them that we have a legitimate reason for the SMTP functionality, because without it, you can't set up an account. And I think they'll understand, because they said that they'll work with customers. So anyway, that's all I got.
Well, thanks, Dan and Alan, for all your efforts in that regard. Arnold, who is telling us that he is still incognito, is also telling us he's running Linux Mint 20.3 Cinnamon with no significant issues. He also wanted to mention that Alan's audio, and I noticed this as well, your audio is considerably louder than the rest of ours. So you may want to try tweaking that when you have an opportunity, but it's not deafening or anything, but it is, it's like a little bit like that. So Pete, what you got going on?
I have in my basement, or in my family room downstairs, 4 ancient desktop computers that people have given me over the years. And they have slowly, I can't even remember what versions of Linux I was running on them, but they've slowly died. There's only one out of the 4 still working, and it's running Windows XP. So one of my projects is to go through all 4 of them, pick out the ones pick out the one, see if I can make one better one out of the 4 by moving hardware and selecting, more RAM, or those that support more RAM. 2 issues that I am running into they are old enough that I think they call it EFI, the old BIOS. And I don't know if any of the new Linux distributions support the old style BIOS, number 1. And I guess number 2, what version of Linux will run on something that's not the latest, but be usable. And I don't know if the type of BIOS that's in these ancient machines is going to be a killer or not. I don't. Does anybody know if the newer Linux systems support the old style BIOS any longer, or is that long gone?
Well, the old style BIOS MBR is pretty much deprecated. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
So what do? Chuck all these computers, or?
Well, if it's deprecated, they'll still run. You can still use it.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you meant it didn't support.
And you can go back and get an older historical release of Linux that's still going to work fine.
Right.
Okay.
They don't just stop working when they are aged out. So you can most sites, if you look at it, they'll say other options or other distributions, or even older distributions.
Uh-huh.
Go back and get back a few years to where EFI was the standard, and probably just keep them running that way.
Gotcha.
So officially, nothing has dropped BIOS support. The biggest thing is probably going to be there's talk. It comes up in the Fedora release about once a year that they want to drop support for BIOS. Actually, the new thing is they want to drop support for pre Haswell x64 too. So
Oh, really?
Yep. But the bigger problem is going to be 32-bit support. A lot of distributions have dropped 32-bit entirely. Debian still has a 32-bit release. Slackware still has a 32-bit release. I've got Debian running on a Pentium 2, so
Yep.
it'll work. But Fedora, I think maybe Mint, Ubuntu, have all dropped their 32-bit ISO. You can't get those anymore.
Okay.
But there were early 64-bit computers that were BIOS only, so they still have BIOS support, but not 32-bit processors.
Okay. I think one of the machines is a 64-bit machine. So
Well, the one running Windows probably must be a 64-bit.
I don't think it is.
Yeah,
No, XP would run on a 32.
Yeah,
Yeah.
XP was 32-bit. There was
it? Okay.
There was a 64-bit version of XP, but nobody used it. I mean, there was almost no support for it. Vista was the first viable 64-bit Windows.
Okay. Which I run Mint on my machines upstairs. Which version of Mint would support or be something I would want to look at as far as?
I don't know about Mint, to be honest. I think they would have dropped when Ubuntu, because they're based on Ubuntu, right?
Right, yeah.
And Ubuntu dropped 64-bit 5 or 6 years. I mean 32-bit, 5 or 6 years ago. This was like 2016 or something like that.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. So I imagine you're probably looking at like whatever 16 or 17 version that they had. I would look at Debian. That's probably that's the first one on that list there. That's probably the most Tumbleweed, OpenSUSE Tumbleweed's listed on here too. That's probably the most mainstream. Well, Linux Mint's on this list too. Do they actually still have 64-bit? I would have thought they would have had to drop because of their Ubuntu base. Download. Let's see.
Did it say which version of Mint?
No, I just said that one. Let me see. Is there?
Looks like 19.2 supports 32-bit.
Okay, so that's been 3 or 4 years ago now. I can't remember when did Ubuntu drop. Ubuntu drop 32-bit.
It's been a while. It's been years.
Okay, yeah. So looks like maybe the LTS 1804 version was the last one that had a 32-bit release. So that would be Mint 19 would be based on 1804 because they follow the Ubuntu. I thought it was earlier than that. So they follow the Ubuntu LTS releases. So, but yeah.
So you think 18 or 19 then?
Well, it's showing 19 has 32-bit option.
Yeah, so
Yes,
Linux
okay.
Mint, it's a little confusing. Linux Mint 19 is based on Ubuntu 1804, right? Because they track
Right.
they're based on the Ubuntu LTS releases, which are every other even year. So like 1804, 2004, 2204 LTS releases.
Right.
And so that I guess 1804 Ubuntu is the last one with a 32-bit release.
Support,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
If you're building something more servery, something more like to do a specific task, I would consider starting with Debian as suggested. I just found a link for Linux Mint Debian Edition, which is based upon Debian and as such still has a 32-bit version. So that's another possible way to go. That's a little more, updated.
Yeah. Debian is I ran it for a desktop for years and stuff, and it's yep, that would be the way I would go for an older machine too.
Okay. All right. I'll check that all out. One of the machines was given to me by a friend who is musician and produces his own CDs and DVDs, and it was a real high-end machine many years ago. It had, backup, disk drive backup where it did mirroring, and it had a super duper video card at the time to do rendering for his covers for his CDs. But it's only a 32-bit machine. So
Rusty has a question.
go ahead, Russ.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm back after the debacle of I don't know, at some point on this Android phablet tablet, I lost, I seemed disconnected. It seemed to be at the moment that live streaming started. But
Yes.
Anyway, I found my way back eventually where on a laptop where I don't have a camera. Could I ask for some clarification of the meaning of UEIF or UEFI in relation to MBR and GPT? MBR seems to be something only about the space allocated to the bootloader, and GPT seems to be one of the other paradigms for allocating larger bootloader space, which is all at the beginning of a drive, regardless of whether you require boot partitions or not. And everything, so a boot partition is all about the kernel. A bootloader space is all about the bootloader, and MBR is one paradigm, GPT is another. What in the heck is UEFI? Is that not a paradigm about some sort of security or identification layer? But can someone make some sense out of all this? I can tell you, you can start reading and everyone starts going through the acronyms, and I still don't know anything when I finish reading an article because I don't have a rule of thumb that orients me. So I'm open to hearing from anyone on this.
So we would have to take a trip back to the 1980s to start with this. As with all things, if you want to make an apple pie, first you have to create the universe. But so when Compaq first cloned the IBM PC, they cloned the BIOS that it used in order to make it bootable. And that's basic input-output system. It's a little piece of firmware on a chip on your motherboard that does things like initialize all of the peripherals, all of your, at the time, ISA cards, all of your floppy controllers. Nowadays, it initializes, it's a lot smarter nowadays. It's got a little operating system on it that does a lot of things and actually has its own network stack. But back then, so Compaq cloned the PC, they cloned the BIOS. The BIOS was a mess. IBM kind of bolted it together as it was never meant to hang around that long. The IBM engineers who made it basically said, we just wanted something to start the machine up and prepare it for the operating system. And so we just kind of bolted it together. It meant to hang around for a few years, and then they were going to replace it. Compaq cloned it, and then everyone else cloned it, and it became a standard. Microsoft wrote Windows in order to boot from a BIOS system. And lo and behold, 20 years later in the early 2000s, it was still around. It was starting to show its age. Larger disks. There was bolt-on things for, like, if you remember the old 48-bit LBA fiasco, or if you had a hard drive bigger than 120 gigs or something like that. That was a firmware issue with the BIOS. And so they started in the early 2000s working on a UEFI consortium of makers did. And that's the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. And basically, it replaces the BIOS. It has a BIOS compatibility layer into it because when UEFI first came out in the mid-thousands, a lot of OSs, Windows XP, didn't know how to boot from it. I think Mac OS was, ironically, when they switched to Intel, was the first major uptake of UEFI. But UEFI is more advanced. It's got its own network stack. If you manage PCs for like a corporation, it's got some more advanced features, but it also does the same things that the BIOS does. You know, it prepares your system for the operating system to boot. Excuse me.
So just a moment. Does this mean that UEFI requires more than what MBR bootloader physical space can provide? In other words, is there a correlation between, is UEFI associated with a paradigm such as GPT disk architecture?
Yes. So BIOS relies on MBR, the master boot record. There are some limitations with that. UEFI actually has its own boot partition and multi-boot support. It can boot, UEFI can boot from an MBR disk or a GPT disk. A BIOS machine can only boot from an MBR disk. But GPT allows for larger than 2 terabyte partitions. It allows for more than 4 partitions per disk, whereas MBR is limited to 4. And you have like a little 500 megabyte partition at the start of the disk. That's if you ever dual booted, it's got like a little partition there, and that's where your bootloader, UEFI bootloader is. In fact, a lot of distributions are moving away from Grub and just using the UEFI shim, because UEFI can support, like on my laptop there, it had Windows on it at one point, doesn't anymore, but it's still, you can load, you can reorder the operating systems inside the BIOS, like it lists Fedora and Windows, and all the dual booting stuff. So it kind of, UEFI is more advanced and can actually take the place of Grub in your bootloader. And so, yes, there is a connection between GPT and UEFI. Grub, Grand Unified Bootloader. Yes. Yep. That was what it was supposed to be. Grub is kind of replaced Lilo. I remember Lilo from the Slackware days, and they're kind of
lost out.
Yep.
Yep.
That was kind of, I don't know, it wasn't a hack, but it was a way around the limitations of a BIOS, and it's kind of redundant in the UEFI days. A lot of Linux distributions include it just out of legacy, stuff, or that's the way it's always been. But I think Fedora is looking, and Ubuntu are looking at moving into UEFI shims and using that as the bootloader. But yeah, so there is a link between that. UEFI machine can boot from an MBR or generally special cases, Intel Macs can only boot from a GPT disk. They don't have any MBR support.
So if a machine comes alive through the UEFI firmware, how would I say, elements, then it gets greater. It's going to just use whatever disk architecture is available at the time that input output is established, and GPT determines whether or not you can get greater disk capacity and who knows, whatever, maybe more partitions. But but then UEFI is inherently a concept that requires a small boot partition as well. It's not only a different firmware than old BIOS. It depends on more space that is above and beyond the initial boot. Whatever the boot BIOS or extensible firmware elements are, it requires that boot partition to get to an operating system.
Right. Yes. It requires that little 500 megabyte partition.
Thank you.
Yep. Unless you're using, unless you're unless you're using a legacy boot BIOS mode, then it can read an MBR just like a regular BIOS can. Some of the newer hardware is removing the legacy BIOS support. If you want to make sure you're using EFI mode, boot into your BIOS, hitting F2 or whatever the hotkey is on your machine, and disable legacy BIOS support. That's usually what I do, because all the Linux distributions support UEFI these days. Most of them support secure boot even, and I enable secure boot these days for a little added extra security. And that way you make sure you're booting into UEFI mode, because sometimes the boot menu is a little, if you hit the key to boot from your Linux USB drive or CD drive, you might notice there's like 2 or 3 different options for the same thing. Well, one of those is probably the legacy BIOS boot mode, and one is probably the UEFI, and sometimes it's hard to tell which is which by looking at them. So it's just easier to disable the legacy BIOS support unless you really need it for some reason, which these days I don't think there's really a good reason to have it on a modern machine anymore. Other people can chime in on that, but I think if you're running a modern Mint, Debian, Fedora, Red Hat, even Slackware, Arch, all these, even if you're running like Antex or something that's a derivative, they all support UEFI boot modes, and there's just much more functionality in the UEFI mode than there is in the BIOS.
So I think I hear you saying that if you enable legacy boot rather than disable legacy, if you enable legacy boot, then your machine will boot from with UEFI firmware from a master, from a disk that has been prepared with MBR.
That's correct. It allows for that. Yeah,
it's like it's almost like a double entendre, or it's some sort of trick of language. Well, anyway, thank you.
Welcome to the minefield that is legacy support. Anyway, so
that was a really good explanation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very good.
Pete, did you have anything else, Pete?
No.
All right, Leander, let's keep going with you then.
There we go. I muted myself. So I've been somebody, I think it was Gene, mentioned how Linux has gotten boring. I will counter that with, as someone who works with new hardware frequently, just buy yourself a new box. And it's the latest 12th gen Intel stuff has been like a trip back 20 years as far as Linux support and bugs and crashing and breaking and not working. So if you're bored, buy a new computer. My advice there, a few years ago, apparently, or a few months ago,
I'm still a legacy kind of guy.
So, a few months ago, Intel apparently had a shakeup of their open source people, and it's taken a few years to matriculate down into the products. And after having messed with 12th gen Intel mobile stuff for a while, I can see it. They used to be the gold standard of just works on Linux, and 12th gen is a train wreck. Anyway, so if you're bored, maybe buy yourself a new laptop for Christmas, and the excitement of early 2000s Linux will be right back with you, and things not working and stuff like that.
Do you think that's intentional or just incompetent?
Intel's on struggle street right now. Losing. I got to be careful what I say because I have information, but that's anyway, I can't say. But Intel's kind of the Apple, losing Apple as a customer kind of hit them kind of hard. They've had a lot of about 10 years ago, the accountants kind of took over, and a lot of engineers to have like a division inside of Intel that was responsible for their open source contributions. And that's why their Linux support was so great. They coded all of the drivers for the video cards and the Wi-Fi stuff and submitted it to the Linux kernel and then got it in there. But now that group has been disbanded and pushed out into other product teams. And so a good example is the new webcams and the new Linux and the new laptops with the 12th gen is the IP-U6 cameras. They, instead of upstreaming the driver for those into their serial connected device, and instead of not serial, I forget the name of the interface, but it's not USB. Anyway, it's my brain just shut off for a second. But instead of upstreaming the support for these cameras, they just basically put a wrapper around the Windows driver, and it doesn't really work, and only works in Ubuntu, and is like uses like 20, all your CPU power for like 480p video, and if you're not using Ubuntu, well, then you're just kind of out of luck. So it's sleep modes they've removed in favor of Microsoft's hybrid sleep strategy. So I think a lot of it now I would definitely recommend looking at AMD over Intel for a Linux machine, just because I think they're struggling. The good news is AMD and Intel seem to have sniped a lot of Apple's silicon people. Everyone's going all around and around. The M2 has not been the big jump that the M1 was, and that's largely because Intel and AMD have been sniping talent from Apple, because Apple has been, we'll say, cantankerous with work policies, and so a lot of people have been with work from home policies, and so a lot of their engineering talent is getting snapped up. So for us on the PC side, that'll probably be a good thing. That means maybe these chips will improve, because the Apple ARM stuff is quite the piece of engineering. So, but yeah, so it's, like I said, buy a new Intel stuff, and I'm surprised. We're hitting into 13th gen Intel now, and so I'm surprised that the 12th gen support isn't any better than it was closer to launch. Like I said, buy a new computer. So if you're bored and you want something to troubleshoot, other than that, I upgraded my workstation, the Fedora 37. Pretty uneventful. I did run into an OpenCL bug with the new version of RockM. I put a few months ago when graphics card prices dropped, I treated myself to an RX 6900 XT and put it in here. And there's some OpenCL bug with excuse me, with RockM and Darktable, and so I've had to disable my OpenCL support for now. But other than that, it's been pretty smooth sailing. Work has been crazy. I guess I can complain about it since neither of my other coworkers are here. If you don't know what a story point is, just please be thankful for that, or Agile or Scrum. Anyway, please be thankful for that. But yeah, work's been crazy. I've just been trying to keep up and finish up my class for the semester. That's kind of been it. Thought I had more to talk about, but just emptied my brain for the moment.
Are you still doing the Japanese?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
How's it going, Leander?
It's going pretty well. I have my good days and my bad days. There's times when like everything's firing on all 8 cylinders, or and I can keep up conversation. But I've noticed there are times when I'm either stressed out or tired, and it's just like all I hear is like it's just hard for me to like grasp it sometimes. I don't know if that's an age thing or what. I'm getting into my late 30s now, so I don't know if my brain plasticity just isn't there anymore. But it's one of those things that if I keep up with it, I could usually stay on top of it. But if I take a break, it starts to fade away pretty quick. But
You're not going to get much sympathy out of us bunch of old men.
So, well, part of the reason why I started this is I hear if you pick up another language, and it helps prevent dementia later on in life, because your brain, it helps rewire your brain in different ways and promotes good neuron growth. Other than that, just kind of working around the house. Had got ambitious and started doing some yard work. We've been in our house about 8 years now, so the old landscape timbers that the previous owners put down have started to return to the earth. I started to think about, hey, you know what? Rocks don't rot. So I've been taking the truck out, buying some, stones, pavers and stuff, and replacing those just kind of piecewise as we have time to take out the old rotted wood. I figure also the those landscape timbers are probably treated with some pretty crazy out there chemicals that get into the ground and give you all sorts of weird tumors. So probably better just to go with the old school rock method of hardscape. So, but that's been, technology gripe. So our washing machine that's 12 years old is starting to go out. At first I thought it was just a bearing. But I think it's the actual gearbox. You know, they've got a reduction gearbox in there, and it's got a couple bearings in it. I can't find a bearing to replace inside, and you've got to pull the whole. You got to split the gearbox apart and pull it all apart, and then replace the bearings. And you can get the whole gearbox for that washer, but it was a $500 washer, brand new, 12 years ago. The gearbox is like $350, $400 just for the part, and I was like, well. $100 more. We could probably get a new washer with a new pump and everything in it. Maybe it's more.
Those days are gone.
Yeah. I did find you can still get a $500 or $600 washer at Lowe's. And that'll probably be the one I get, even though it's like the tiny little apartment one, because every one of them has Alexa in it or some kind of internet connection. Like if you get one of the ones that's the bigger capacity or, has the as I'm always looking at efficiency. I'm on a well, so I'm like, let's get the one that uses less water. And I'm like, who needs to connect their washing machine to the internet? I'm sitting here thinking, I keep a washing machine, a decade, usually 10, 15, 20 years is not crazy out of a washing machine. And I'm like, who needs in another 10 or 15 years? I mean, who's going to be updating? Is Whirlpool going to be updating these washing machines that have these chips in them that have these? I mean, because they just got a little computer in them. And so, yeah, it's a real struggle to find a washing machine of all things. It seems that's just a plain old disconnected box.
Welcome to
sound like you
IoT,
wanna-
Leander.
What?
Welcome to IoT.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no thanks. No thanks.
Leander. A couple of things I found. Number one, the new machines are very expensive. They're chipped. They have all kinds of fancy features, and they do not last as long as the older ones that ran on relays. If you get 4 or 5 years out of it, you're doing well. I found a site online. I do not remember what it is, but it's like a Goodwill, and they buy working washers, dryers, refrigerators. They disassemble them and they sell the parts from anywhere from $6 to $15. So you might be able to get a gearbox for that version of machine for maybe $15.
Right.
So, but I'd have to go through my orders and see if I can find the one that I had to replace the thermostat in my 1970 hot point refrigerator. 1994 hot point refrigerator. They don't make that part any longer. Nobody had it, except I found this one site. So I got it for $6. I put it in and it works great. That's something to check out, I think, if you're into fixing things.
That would be good. I don't mind putting $100 into a part for a decade-old washer. It's just kind of one of those things that if you put a $350 part into it, and then like the pump goes out or something, and then you gotta find
whatever comes next. Yeah,
that's so that's kind of that would be a good site to have. It's the bearings aren't stamped or anything, because I was thinking, well, I could just pull the I've got a press, I could pull it out and just get it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're sealed, and you can't. I mean, there's no stamp on them to go look for a part number online or anything. So you're kind of, I guess you have to buy the whole assembly. That's. That is what it is. But I guess not many people are that deep into stuff these days. So
I tell you. The old stuff just keeps running and running. Occasionally, you got to throw a part in.
I've had pretty good luck over the years with Craigslist, although I don't know how things are over in your neck of the woods.
Craigslist is pretty dead. That's the one thing I keep a Facebook account for, is the marketplace functionality has really replaced Craigslist around this area. You'll see something pop up on Craigslist once a month or something, but it's pretty dead. So, but yeah, I should check that. But yeah, it's a pretty common GE brand washer. So and these companies, when they do manufacturing at scale, I'm sure they use this same gear reduction box in like 6 different models so there's probably one floating around out there I can get if I can just find it somewhere. So
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Have you looked on eBay?
I have, and that's where I found the ones for like $300 or $400 that matched. So and that's just a little iffy to me to buy it for that much off of eBay. Yeah. And then if it's not the right one, because they don't make these things serviceable unless you have, like, if you're an appliance repair guy, I guess you have a dealer or something you can contact and they can assure you it's the right part. But if you don't, you're kind of looking at numbers and trying to match things up, and hopefully that the person on the other end has matched their numbers correctly. So yeah, but that's been Arnold, that's what I was trying to find. I didn't see any numbers stamped on it. For my typewriter repair hobby, there's I know that because there's Coleman Manufacturing. You can call them with the number off of a spring or something, and they can, again, these companies didn't make these parts. They buy them off the line and they mass produce them and use them in so many different models. So yeah, but I didn't see any number stamped on this, and I checked online and other people said the same thing, that they couldn't find any number stamped on the bearing either. So I don't know if that's intentional on their part or if they just bought the cheapest Chinese made one that they could when they built it. Who knows? So
yeah, I've experienced woes recently with washing machines. I had to replace mine because the electronics components failed, and it just seems like the reliance upon these somewhat sensitive electronics in a room that's almost like certainly going to be too humid, just not a positive environment for such things. I think if I experience another short lifetime with a washer again, or the one I just bought, I'm going to become a Speed Queen customer because I hear nothing but good things about them, but they're quite pricey. But yeah, I'd like something a little more old school than what I ultimately ended up getting.
I don't understand it. It's the same thing with like, although I'm seeing it backlash against in the automotive industry, where there's kind of become a meme now where some car model put the glove box button on the touch screen to unlock your glove box. So like, yeah, so I'm seeing as people started making fun of that, and was like, I don't want to have to click 2 buttons in a menu to open my freaking, just put a latch on the box like it's been for years. So I'm seeing some backlash against some of this ridiculousness from the younger generation too. So I think that's probably, hopefully common sense will start to prevail. It'll be like, hey, maybe you don't need to put an internet connected gubbins in it. You can just, put a latch on the door. Come on.
No,
guys.
even worse, you're going to have to subscribe to the deep clean feature of your washer.
There you
extra $20 a month.
That's you joke, but that's becoming a thing. What is it? The Mercedes and then BMW.
Beamer, yeah.
They've been talking about that, and that's.
Don't forget the IoT front door latch.
Oh, I have a coworker who he's about 10 years younger than me, and he lives in Boone proper, rents an apartment. It's a newer apartment. This is another reason why I'm not the happiest homeowner. There are times I just want to like burn the whole thing down and go back to renting and make maintenance someone else's problem. But a lot of apartments in town are requiring the smart home stuff. Like the landlord installs it, and then you have to. And this young man, he's not that young, but he's in his early 30s, is renting an apartment, and he doesn't have a key. He has an electronic. They gave him he has an app on his phone. Everything in his apartment is controlled through the app, including his front door lock. And I asked him, I'm like, well, what happens if the batteries die in your front door lock? Like, can you not get in? Like, do you have to wait for them to come and replace it? There's no backup. It's just, there's no key. There's not even a hole in his door for a key. It's just like a hotel thing, but it's with a smartphone. And it's just, it's over the gee whiz factor at some point. it just, I mean, why? To me, I'm just like, maybe it's just I'm getting old and cantankerous, but it's, it's he's kind of the same way. He was like, it was neat for the first week, and I started thinking about it, and I'm like, this seems like a bad idea. And yeah, so it's becoming pervasive. I don't know what to do about it or anything really can do about it. Hopefully it's one of those trends that in 20 years we look back on this and go, that was a bad idea. Let's not do that again.
Automotive engineers, manufacturers did away with slots in car doors a long time ago. You know, fob, if your battery runs out on your fob, how do you get in the car?
My car's, let's see, the newest car I have is a 2013, and it's still got a keyhole in the door. So
Does it?
Yep.
Although I would hate to be deprived of those commercials where the guy's talking to his refrigerator and his microwave. Have you seen that? Yeah. Those are hilarious.
I don't get it. I just don't. Yeah. No thank. I want my stuff as dumb and disconnected as it can get.
Absolutely.
I don't understand the washing.
Live streaming is on.
Your washing load from remote that doesn't serve. Why does it anyway? I don't know. I don't get why that needs to be connected. Security cameras, maybe thermostats make a little bit of sense. You can set the temperature up and have it warm by the time you get home or something. But a washing machine, why does that need to? You can't put clothes in it when you're not there. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, I'm ranting, so I'll be quiet.
Well, thanks, Leander. Larry, what you got going on?
I'll rant some too.
Kenny,
I'm
Steve,
always
where'd you come
ranting about all these smart devices. You know, I mean, your refrigerator is supposed to automatically see what you have in your refrigerator and fill it and refill it for you, so you don't have to do anything. I think this stuff is kind of crazy too, all this smart stuff. But since you got into washers and dryers, I have washer and dryer that are probably 25 years old. And the washing machine, I mean, they both sort of work. I mean, the washing machine timer stopped turning years ago, and I got another timer online. Problem is I couldn't get one with the exact same part number. It was the same number, except it had the A or B or C version at the end. So I asked the guy, well, will the C version work in place of the A version? He said, well, make me an offer. So I just bought the C version, put it on there, and it works perfectly.
All right.
I mean, it was $10 or something cheap, you know. And then as far as the clothes dryer goes, it works. It gets hot, but the fan belt on it broke Thanksgiving. So now I'm talking to somebody about what fan belt, and he wants to know the model number and serial number of the clothes dryer, and I can't find anything about that on there. There's a lot of part numbers on all over the thing on various labels and some parts, but there's a number stamped on the belt, and I gave him that number, and it seems like it gives a replacement for that belt anyway. But it has 4 ribs replacement, and the one I have has 5 ribs. That is, it's each rib, or I call them ridges, they call them ribs. Each rib is like a 1/16 of an inch wide. So mine is 5/16 of an inch, and the replacement is 4/16, 1/4 inch. So anyway, at least it's not smart. That's what counts for me.
I've had luck taking the broken belt down to the auto parts store, and they compare it to what they've got in stock and get something that works.
Yeah, that's a belt for a car, though.
Doesn't matter if it's the right length and close to the right width, it'll work.
A belt is a belt is a belt.
Yep.
That's what I agree. But anyway, I'll probably, this is $7, $8 or something, $9 or whatever. So I mean, I bought a cheap belt for my car too, and it didn't last very long. And I'm stuck with car trouble again. Had to get a new belt.
Yeah.
It was just a piece of junk that I bought belt. So anyway, that's my soapbox uh, on smart devices. I mean, I keep ranting and ranting about the smart crap, what I call everything has to be smart. You know, these days that's way stupid as far as I'm concerned. Another comment, Rusty was talking about multi-boot, and you've been talking about MBR and GPT and UEFI and so forth. These computers that I have are not real new. I mean, this is a Dell Inspiron laptop that had 32-bit Vista, or it still has 32-bit Vista on the hard drive. And I've got another one just like it. And I've got some Lenovo computers. They were upgraded to Windows 10, I think, and Windows 7, which is on them. And I've got, I think, an Acer laptop and a Toshiba laptop, which might be the only one that has UEFI. And I mean, it does have a setting where you can switch back to the legacy booting and recognize MBR partitions and so forth. But what I do with these things, I don't know how this works with newer devices, but I press a key on the keyboard like F12. Like I plug in a USB device like a hard drive or just a thumb drive, whatever, that has grub on it. And I press the key and it gives, and I guess to me that's multi-boot, but that's not software. That's part of the BIOS, I guess, or the UEFI stuff. And it gives me and it looks around and finds what devices are bootable and gives me a list. So how does that compare to what I mean, it works on all of them, all these different Toshiba and Acer, Lenovo, Dell, all these things. I'm able to press a key and get a menu that I can select from and then go to whatever device it is I've selected to boot. How's that? I mean, is that, I call that multi-boot, but that's not like multi-boot software. I mean, well, not like, open source software as far as, because it's proprietary stuff. So how does that, nobody mentioned anything like that earlier in this meeting.
Well, Larry, what you've got there is you've got your multi-boot capability within the BIOS, whereas a true multi-boot would be within the operating system. Well, actually, that's not true. It would come up in your boot menu screen rather than the BIOS itself.
Yeah, but if I do this, then I tell it to boot off like the USB drive or USB device, whatever. Mm-hmm. And then the Grub will come up, and Grub has a menu. Right. So and Grub can boot Windows and have multi-boot many things too. So there's all kinds of multi-boot going on, it seems like.
Right. I mean, that's kind of what I touched on, is that it's a bit with UEFI. Grub is a bit redundant now. What you got there when you hit your F12, your F11, it depends on the computer, is, the UEFI or the BIOS can look for bootable devices and present you a list of them. And that's kind of depending, that's what the firmware's job is to look for, is to wake the computer up, get the peripherals initialized and get it into a state at which it can hand off everything to the operating system. And that's kind of that boot menu that you get when you hit the F12 is kind of the final stage of that. Is it's the BIOS or the EFI has woke everything up, got the disks ready, got the processor and the RAM all initialized, got all your PCI cards ready to go, and is saying, okay, what do I have to hand this off to? And by default, there's an order that you can go into a lot of BIOSes and change. Like if you've got 2 hard drives, you can switch the order that they boot, or your DVD drive or whatever, you can switch which one it tries to boot from first. But if you've just got a one off, you can just hit your F12 key, and if you just want to boot from this DVD for just this one instance, you can just tell it to boot for that one time. But yeah, that's the final stage of that. And on a UEFI system, the operating system can inform the UEFI that I'm available to boot. And so I wish I could show you a screencast from my laptop, but if you go into the BIOS on that after you install Linux, it lists Fedora literally by name as bootable inside the BIOS. So the operating system can inform the BIOS that it's capable of booting in a UEFI system by name through that partition. So it's Grub is a bit redundant now, I think, and there are some movements. There's some movement kind of away from it for newer systems. But yeah, so you're right. There are a bunch of different ways to do a multi-boot. That doesn't even get into the ways of doing a dual boot system through Windows with BCD edit and stuff like that. Windows has a bootloader that you can install and use much like Grub. I wouldn't recommend it because, conveniently it tends to forget, if you install a Windows update, it tends to forget about your other operating systems that you have installed because they don't really want you using those. But there are, you are right. There are 600 different ways of doing a multi-boot system. Again, welcome to the minefield that is legacy support.
Well, if it's already built into the BIOS or UEFI, to me, it's just extra redundancy throwing in something like multi-boot, more software on top of more software on top of more software. Just looking for, you're going to have trouble with more and more software.
That's kind of why they're trying to move away from Grub and stuff nowadays. Grub and Lilo and stuff was all kind of around in the BIOS days, and the BIOS didn't really have the way to handle a multi-OS environment. It just kind of looked at the master boot record, and then you had to have something that came off the master boot record that handled your different operating systems. Now, the UEFI is smarter, and these things are redundant. So, again, they're still included in a lot of Linux distributions because, for example, my rack mount server that I have in a colo down in Raleigh, Durham. It's a Coffee Lake Intel chip, which is 8th or 9th gen. And it doesn't have full UEFI support. UEFI support until Windows 11 was really kind of hacky on some systems that, and you got some systems that were halfway supported it or supported a halfway baked implementation or didn't support it at all for some reason. So it's Windows. One good thing I'll give Microsoft is that with Windows 11 and their stringent requirements for TPM 2.0, secure boot and everything is really made, a lot of hardware come up to date with what they support, especially in the server space. Desktops have supported UEFI extensively for probably 5 or 7 years now, but in the server space, it's been real hit or miss. But yeah, again, it's just it's a chicken and the egg problem. They can't take the Grub out of the distributions until they're sure that most people using a computer have the ability to use a UEFI shim for booting, and so, you're kind of stuck with your Grub stuff until what time they deem its ability to remove it and not affect users. Does that make sense?
I guess.
Yeah, in the Windows world too. Go ahead.
I'm not going to go around jumping on everything, the new and the latest of everything, like Gene or somebody was saying about washing machines. Almost anything new you buy now doesn't last like the old stuff. It's just most of the stuff that's in the supply chain stuff on the ships is pretty much junk, made out of plastic, and it's not very hard to break it. I mean, I got some kids here and they break everything, So, well, I think probably that's it for me right now. I mean, I was thinking about talking about some historical stuff. I got an old car I've been working on. It's an 86 carburetor, and the manual or the documentation I have it printed at the top. It says 1987 Chrysler computerized engine controls. If there was today, it would be called smart engine, smart carburetor. But that's all it means is somebody put some electronics on it.
What carburetor? There's no carburetor.
It has 3 solenoids and 3 switches on it, and now it's smart. Or the language is, I'm objecting to the language. Okay, everything is computerized, fine, but it's not smart.
Larry, the fuel injection did away with carburetor.
Oh yeah, I know. I got a fuel injected car
Yeah.
too. I even had a 75 Opel, I think, that had fuel injection on it, but I don't have that anymore. So I mean, I've messed with fuel. I mean, I've had messed with fuel injection, but this car just had a carburetor.
I don't know if those
They've been gone for more than 20 years.
I don't know if those early fuel injected throttle body fuel injections are really much better than a carburetor. They just kind of stuck one fuel injector there at the throttle body, and it just kind of, kind of.
Well, this one had an injector for every cylinder, and the documentation claimed that you can control the fuel mixture at each cylinder separately. And then when I looked at the wiring, I could easily see that either they were all firing, opening the injectors at the same time, or they're all off. It was just bullshit about being able to control the fuel to each cylinder separately.
Larry, remember in the 50s, they had carburetors that you put oil on the top of it.
Look, when I grew up, I worked on cars with my father. All we had was carburetors. That was the way it was. That was the standard.
Yeah.
So that's what I grew up with. And that's sort of, at times I'm still, in my first childhood. These kids here, I'm in my third childhood.
The port fuel injection, a lot of American companies, that was my parents were always one of those, we buy American around here kind of people. Then when I got to school, I bought an 87 Toyota, and because I wanted my car to work anyway. But I worked on enough Fords and Chryslers growing up that I'll never own a Chrysler product. In fact, my dad just recently bought he was a longtime Chrysler owner and, Dodge trucks and stuff. And he finally bought a Honda Ridgeline a couple of years ago. And he's like, I get it now. This thing rides nice. It doesn't break down. And, it gets good gas mileage. And, he had always had 318 V8s and everything. And, but yeah, I feel like the foreign cars are a lot farther ahead on the tech, like that old mid 80s Toyota had like port fuel injection and all this other stuff. And our early, my parents still had early 90s Ford and an early 90s Dodge truck that had like they bragged about their EFI, but it was really just, there was a throttle body where the carburetor went on this motor, and they just stuck a fuel injector in the side of the throttle body that just like peed fuel into the intake manifold like a carburetor would. I'm like, that's really not, that advanced. So yeah, I feel like the American cars are kind of slow on the uptake of getting rid of some of that stuff. But of course, now that's kind of flopped. They've really kind of, Ford especially seems to have come a long way on the technology engine management side stuff. But yeah.
Anything else, Larry?
I'll stop for now.
All right, Steve, it looks like you bounced in and out. Can you talk to us? You're muted at the moment.
Yes. Can you hear
Very
me?
good.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I came in 3 times. This is using the Jitsi Meet app rather than the browser. And I came in 3 times and it couldn't manage. And after I put my headset on, it couldn't manage. So the third time was the charm. And I don't know what it needs, or I would fix it so it would work the first time, hopefully. Anyway, I am going to email Leander because I was fascinated by his comments on how with the UEFI and the right hardware, you can not need grub. I'm not sure that that's an advantage because grub has multiple things you can do. Not that I know how to do them, but there are certain things that I understood could help you if your system wasn't working right, or selections you could make from grub. And I'm not sure how to do that with a UEFI. And I do wonder whether that involves that famous F12, which is how you would manually select what to boot. using the UEFI and selecting different distros. But anyway, rather than having him go over stuff he already said, and I'll just waste those comments and I'll email him to ask him to tell me a little bit about it. What have I been doing? Much the same stuff, computer-wise. Still trying to get Pipewire to work on a distro without systemd, and it highlights how little I know about the substitute session and something else management approaches when you don't have systemd. I'm trying to understand console kit, and I'm trying to understand seatd, which for some of the no systemd distros is used to successfully enable Pipewire to work. And my motivation is twofold. One is for Pipewire is I like the idea of something that is apparently designed independently of systemd, although it by default uses systemd, and that it seems to be generally felt to be a marked improvement in terms of its capabilities, both for video and audio for Linux. And while I'm not going to be one of the edge cases, I'm not doing pro audio or pro video anytime soon. I like the idea of being able to have a better capability, even though I don't understand the capabilities of pulse audio, much less. And to be honest, I don't think I'm not an expert on ALSA to begin with. So it's kind of a quixotic search for trying to help the people in my distribution who at some point might be faced with a choice between ALSA, which isn't working well for them, because a lot of people complain about some aspects of that, and using pulse audio if pulse audio actually goes away. And a lot of the distributions seem to be swinging over to, Larry, if you want to respond, I saw it pop up. Go ahead.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button.
Oh, okay, well then I'll go on. Otherwise, what am I doing? Well, I mentioned, and I think there was some conversation about I was a schmuck for not having backup, which is true, of a reasonable sort. So I did eventually master the DD command enough to feel comfortable to take the partition on which my late lamented documents directory was located and put that in an image file on another machine, so that if at some point in the future I can recover anything, I'll have that to try to recover it on. And now I just recreated documents, and I actually put one document into that new document directory. So, that was the other thing. What else? Otherwise, computer-wise. So the bottom line is, anybody here who is a knowledgeable person about, and I know most of you use systemd, and so don't get involved in substitutes for the components of systemd. But if there's anybody who has a thought or a reference that I haven't seen about how one properly uses CD or console kit to make things work better without systemd. I think some of it involves adjusting the actual code involved, and perhaps from source. And so at some point, if I need to do that, I will spend a few months, trying to understand and play with that and maybe modify it. There's not much else computer-wise now. Non-computer-wise, I was just going to respond. Dan had mentioned people pouring oil into the carburetor. And when I was younger, I had an old Saab, but not so old. I think it was a 95, Saab 95. And at one point, somebody was about to pour oil into the carburetor, thinking it was a 2-cycle, which is where you apparently put oil. And I stopped him by saying, no, that's a 4-cycle version. Another time, I lived first in northeastern Vermont after finishing residency, and that's where for a time. And so there was commonplace to put a heater around the radiator tubes, so that in the morning, at night, you would plug it in, and you wouldn't have a frozen water, so you couldn't start your car, or a frozen battery. So when we left Vermont and moved to another place where they weren't so familiar, at one point I took it into a garage for routine care, and the mechanic proudly said, "Oh, you had this wire sticking out. Don't worry, I cut it." So this is in anticipation of me see. This is December, next is January. So happy holidays to all, because they're going to come before our next meeting, and otherwise I'll have to email everybody like Dan was doing. And if there's anything that I have written by email that I just forgot to mention, please speak up if you have an answer for me. And finally, I don't know if Rusty has spoken already, but I was interested that he apparently solved his problem using I guess, audio recorder rather than sound recorder, or sound recorder versus audio recorder. And I wish to understand one thing. I hear that fundamentally those are related programs, if not kind of different aspects of the same program. But I'm interested in that follow-up, because it would sound like something that was solved, and I'm always interested in something that's solved in case I run into a situation where I want to solve the same problem. And that's all.
Thanks, Steve. It sounds like earlier you may have missed this, but Leander was saying the best way to get away from the boredom created by the recent maturity of Linux was to buy a new computer. I think you've also offered the option of ideological purity as a way to create problems for yourself. So we have many options for those who want to tinker with things that are broken.
Steve, I put a couple of links in the chat there. One's for EFI stub. The Arch Wiki, even if you don't run Arch Linux, is a tremendous resource. One's for EFI stub, and one is for system deboot, which is kind of an interface to mess with it. But you don't have to use system deboot. You can just use EFI stub directly, and that will allow you to mess with kernel parameters and stuff without grub. I don't think it's as mature, but you can do some of the same functionality that grub provides with that system.
Yeah, there was one thought I had. Oh, so the other thing you made me remember is that on another machine I blasted my Windows accidentally, and what I noticed, what I believe is possibly that it's the EFI boot manager program is gummed up, because the Windows, otherwise the Windows directory seemed to be there. And I'm wondering if you or anybody else has had an experience with just plugging in an EFI boot manager, a generic EFI boot manager, or if each one is individually created when you install Windows and is distinct for that hardware.
That's a good question. On Linux, it's kind of generic. You can, like, I've moved boot drives from machine to machine and had it just work. Windows, that's a good question. Actually, there is a way to do it. Because I did make a Windows 10. There's a tool you can use to make a Windows 10 USB boot drive, like actually install it to a USB drive and like boot to a desktop, not an installer. But I'm not sure what that tool does. As with most of the Windows things, it's a black box to make that work. So there's got to be a way to do that. It just depends on the operating system, though. To a degree. But yeah, you should just be able to rip a drive out and have it, because UEFI just goes out and the firmware just goes out and says, what do I have that's bootable? And as long as you've got that partition on that drive, that's that 500 megabyte UEFI partition, it should find it and go, oh, what you got for me? And then it should tell it what it's got, unless you've overwritten that partition. And I've seen this before, somebody trying to set up a dual boot. So when you install Windows, it creates that partition and Linux can update that partition, but some people accidentally wipe it out. And so you've got your C drive partition still there, but the EFI partition has been, and you can't boot into Windows anymore. To fix that, you would have to recreate it. And I think there's an OS prober thing in Grub that can kind of bring it back. You would have to use Grub for that. They could go out and detect the different operating systems and then form the EFI partition about them, or at least Grub of them, and get you back in the Windows. But if you wipe out that EFI partition, there might be a way if you boot from a Windows USB stick or CD to do a boot fix, to do like there used to be a way to do that. I'd have to look up the exact command, but there seemed to be a way for it to go out and reset that partition back up if you've completely screwed it up somehow. There are ways to fix it.
I have it dual booting, and what happened was I lost the Windows boot. So
Right.
Windows is there on its own partition on the same drive, and the EFI partition is there. That's why I said I think it was the only thing that I think is missing is the EFI boot manager. Originally, it was very funny. I had two EFI boot manager files or directories. One was labeled for Antix, which is the distribution I'm using, and that stopped working. The other one was MX Linux, which is a first cousin, and they cooperate. MX being a medium duty as opposed to a light duty distribution. When I switched one day and said, let's use the MX Linux, then Antix booted fine. And it's been that way. I have no clue as to how that is working, other than they're actually identical, and I actually damaged the Antix file, but the MX was not touched. And so I figured if there is no EFI boot manager file or directory for Windows on that. And
Okay.
that's why I asked if I just plop one in generically, is it likely? Of course, I can just try it and see if nothing happens.
I would boot from I forget the exact, I have to look it up myself, but I would boot from a Windows, is it Windows 10, 7? Is it
10.
Windows 10? Yeah, I would boot from a Windows 10 USB stick. You could make like a USB stick or get one or a CD, well, I guess the DVD, and there's like a recovery option, and it may be automatically able to put that back, or if it can't, they can give you a DOS terminal, and there are some like
There's boot repair,
utilities.
I think.
Yeah, there's some utilities you can manually run to get your Windows entry added back. It may overwrite Linux because that's how Microsoft roll, but you can, once you're back into Windows, you could then boot into a Linux live CD and fix your bootloader that way a lot easier.
Just back up anything I have that I don't want Windows to overwrite.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
Steve, then Windows has its own bootloader too, called the NTLDR, and that's an executable bootloader for Windows.
Okay.
NTLDR.
Yeah, and the question is whether it'll automatically recognize without having the EFI file.
No, I don't think so. I think you have to have that EFI partition.
Yeah, well, we have the partition, but the partition includes several directories. One for Windows, one for MX Linux, one for Antix. And the one that was working is the one for MX Linux, which boots up Antix Linux. So
yeah, something got.
I screwed up something there too.
Yeah.
That was the other thing.
If you want to multi-boot Windows and Linux too, there's an order in which you should do it, and you should really let Grub control it, not Windows.
Yeah, Grub. That's probably one of the because Windows cannot interfere with Grub. That's probably one of the modern use cases for using Grub instead of EFI boot stub, because Windows can interfere with a EFI boot stub to a degree. So yeah, that might be a reason to still be using Grub in the modern world for now.
Yep.
Thank you. Oh,
All right.
Rusty, if he's still there, and if he's got anything to say that he hasn't already said, and if he has said it before, then if he can email me, I'll be happy not to take up people's time.
Rusty here. First, in response to what Leander just said, the modern use of Grub, is this if you're going to use a pen drive multi-boot disk to do sort of repair functions, is it important that, is it fundamental that that's going to be a Grub? Well, okay, a pen drive is a device. Grub is a means of getting to getting to the device with the available BIOS or UEFI. So is it fair to say then any pen drive utility should be composed with Grub? If not, what else is it going to have as a bootloader?
So USB booting is its own special bag of things. I just sent a link. There's a utility I've used in the past that actually does this. So it has its own, Ventoy has its own little bootloader that it puts on the USB drive. So instead of booting straight into whatever you've imaged onto the drive, it boots into a menu, and there's a directory. So like you say you have a 128 gig USB pen drive, you install Ventoy on it, and then it puts an ISO directory. You just drop your ISOs in that directory, and then you boot into Ventoy, and it scans that directory and goes, okay, you've got Ubuntu, CentOS, Windows, and it gives you, like in the screenshot here, a list of the different things. It's a super useful utility. If you're making a USB one, I would look at Ventoy. Just as it's got a little GUI, and you hand it a drive, it installs itself onto that drive, and you just drop your ISOs into the directory and go.
Yeah, Leander, that's the one I'm familiar with. I haven't used the one that was
Ventoy too, and it works.
And I will point out Ventoy, I was leaning that direction, but not ready to make the plunge. And one feature is that Ventoy can be installed, the utility to create a new pen drive can be operated from a Linux a Linux operating system. It's not limited to. I think the other thing called Yummy requires, if you can do it from Linux, but only if you have Wine installed, because so it's really a Windows utility.
Yep.
That's Ventoy is in fact Ventoy you can do it from Linux or Windows. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that Ventoy, I'd hate to digress here, but every time I think of one of these utilities that's operating on your machine, number one, I want to see it to be open source. That's only so there are other eyes and ears. And then I kind of briefly go to the forums to see if there's a real community behind it. And if there is any way to see that there are some strong participants other than, it's hard to even figure out who is the lead developer when you go to a site. And then it's also hard to find out if there are any junior lead developers, because those are the eyes for something that you're putting on your machine.
What are you doing?
Does anybody have any comments on that? Just how do you, I hate to digress here, but it's the whole question of what are the steps that you do to have a minimal trust in a powerful software that's put on your machine? That's probably too broad a question to even ask.
Yeah, that goes that descends into the purview of philosophy, and I think that there's
Bizarro world.
yeah, and I mean at some point, nothing is secure, right? I mean,
Right.
that's just kind of the way it is. You kind of have to go with it. There are bugs in everything. I mean, there are bad bugs in Grub that were security, and Grub is it's Red Hat and other companies dump a lot of money into developing it. So as far as outright malware avoidance, untrusted sources, I try to stick to what comes in the distros repository. Debian and Red Hat, Fedora Ubuntu tend to do a good job with that. I avoid those things that just tell you to run a script in a shell to download and do whatever. I avoid Node.js like the plague because it's bad for that. But yeah, these things, there is a risk. Ventoy is open source. It's, not had any reported problems that I'm aware of. And it's, you're always taking a risk for these things. And, unless you're a genius at programming, it's hard to verify these things on your own. And even if you are, everybody misses things. So, I don't have a good answer for you there on something like that.
Steve, did you have something to add?
Yeah, Security Now. It's every week you can see it on YouTube live, and then it's also a podcast, and there's a website. It's part of a bunch of podcasts done by, sponsored, mainly run by Leo Laporte with Twit TV. So if you go on to YouTube and just look up, search for Security Now, you'll come up with that. The fellow who runs that is Steve Gibson, and they've been running it for like 15 to 17 years. And they go into bugs and malware every week. So you might be able to do a search on their archives if you have specific questions. So that would be one single source that is focused on that.
And Dan, you had something to add as well?
Yeah, when Steve mentioned Steve Gibson, has anybody followed Squirrel to see what the latest is on Squirrel?
Not the latest, Dan. I did install it and try it, but the fact is that unless it's generally usable, I don't know how to make use of it.
Right, same with me.
What are you talking about?
I forget what the Squirrel stands for. It's a cryptography. It's a cryptographic means of authenticating. Steve Gibson's got a great idea with it. I respect Steve Gibson and all he does, but it seemed to me that Squirrel was way out there in the Never Land. I didn't think it was ever going to be embraced by the general public.
Well, it's got to be embraced by the big guys too, and they're coming out with their own things, which I'm not qualified to. I'm too old to remember having heard about it 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago, and a month ago, which is supposed to do something vaguely similar, but his didn't require a password manager. Theirs does. Getting back to Rusty, about your sound solution.
Oh, well, just on the audio question, the problem I posted was just that I needed a recorder with capability to do MP3, because that's what was embedded in a little gadget that I had that could deliver little voice messages with a proximity sensor. So then of Kubuntu, which I have been using, did not have a provided application for voice recording. That led to loading Sound Recorder, and then Sound Recorder worked briefly, but then started coming up with a message saying cannot establish input stream. And so I ended up simply abandoning it. I did try the Joe, who is on our list, had suggested to try to run it from console, but it had the same message. So I found in audio recorder, I think I've got to use it some because it seems to have so many more capabilities, like defining your input stream to available devices, and then one of those input streams to the recorder happens to be the speaker output of your system. It's not it's sort of a reminder of how Jitsi, our Jitsi application here, has got. It must also establish an input stream. So the mysteries of all of these services and all of these streams of data that have to be intercepted. And to add to audio recorder, it also appears to have timers and sensors for turning on and off when there is silence or not sufficient signal. So it strikes me that that's a really great application that I barely begin to understand. So I'm going to stick with that.
Hey, Rusty, I've got a question for you.
You're asking me a question.
Correct.
Good luck.
What have you found to be the easiest to use audio recorder that I could record some messages on an answering machine from my grandson and save them for forever?
Well, like I say, I'm on Kubuntu, which is an Ubuntu derivative, and I don't know why Sound Recorder failed me after a brief after it was usable briefly, and audio recorder seemed to be the thing, and MP3 seems to, OGG and these other encoding formats. It seems that MP3 is what everyone is looking for, and I don't understand the legality of using that in coder. But I will say that Audacity does a good job going from a WAV file, and it gives the benefit of showing, the audio signal strength, and when you're overtaxing the input and distorting. But the problem with Audacity is it's a physical export out of the program. You can create the MP3 by exporting, but it's not natively saving it as it doesn't automatically become an MP3 as a saving format.
Those are all very complicated. I'm looking for something. I just got to, download the app, start it up, and play the answering machine.
Audio recorder seems to be it for me.
Okay.
Rusty, on back to your using sound recorder from terminal. Did you include the -V switch so you would get debugging output? Because that would tell you why the sound recorder app failed. So you may want to try that again.
Okay. Yeah, I still have it installed.
Is it minus?
So I am curious.
I'm not sure. You guys know more about it than I do. Clue him in.
You can also check the logs too.
Are you trying to get our attention, Steve?
No, I'm trying to get the yellow out.
So,
I've got a yellow wall. That's all.
Colgate.
Accident.
so MP3 is actually now unlicensed and encumbered. So it's it's probably the oldest, one of the older compressed lossy formats for audio like that, but it's it's not the best, but it's the most widely supported. And but it's now I was checking, it's now free, so you don't have to worry about like what is it, Fraunhofer, whoever came up with it, pulling something in the future. So I think it's a good archival format now. So I use Audacity for audio recording, but it is a bit Audacity is a bit complicated, I guess, for simple things.
Yeah.
I heard someone is Casio mark the hour, but I think I see. I wasn't wrong. I know that sound. I'll go ahead and get my spiel done, so it doesn't run too late. I just had a few things that came up in the past month. Actually, really just the past week, I've sort of embarked upon bringing all my old CentOS and earlier Debian machines to the new standard of Debian that I'm using for virtual servers, which is Debian 11. And it's kind of been a tour for all these little things I've created in the past several years to help people. Like one was a squid proxy to fix a problem. Another is like an internal SMTP server using postfix to just sort of provide a easy to work with gateway to internally get mail into Exchange and to send it to the internet. It's just so folks don't have to interface directly with Exchange, nor do we have to like have a massive like change controlled thing to interface email. So it just lowers the stakes. Essentially, it just gives us a place to send email through. Another is a monitoring server, which we're still kind of sort of using another thing, but it's we're using Zabbix for some monitoring. And also there's like an SFTP and FTP server and some DNS I'm doing for particular use cases like VPN and BYOD and guest, where they get presented a different view. So I have all these sort of different servers doing different things that I have to move to. I can't just like update them. I'm bringing them to a whole new OS. So I'm building an OS and bringing the stuff over, and in doing so, looking at all the things I've done in the past 5 or 10 years, I'm like, oh, that was a good idea, or maybe I could do that a little better. So it's been a fun review of old stuff. Talking about the maturity of Linux, since I deal with Linux mostly on a server, I mean, it's been to a level of maturity for like 20 years. Like it's been a perfectly mature OS for those uses for a very long time. I do agree it is at a certain level of maturity on the desktop, and it's been that way for a few years that it didn't have when we started tinkering with the thing. Certainly on parity with Windows. There's going to be hardware issues with folks that don't play along nicely, but even that's not nearly what it used to be. The machine I'm working on now, it's been like it's got some hardware issues, but its OS issues have been few and far between through many updates. In fact, like the headset I use, I finally got rid of my duct tape headset. It just wasn't holding together, and I didn't feel like doing a third duct tape job on it. So I tossed that, and this works fine on my Linux box. But for certain apps on my Windows box, it has this weird echo, and it's not hardware. It's not like it's getting like feedback from a microphone. It's a weird artifact that I don't know, and it doesn't happen on all apps. It's certain apps, and it only happens on Windows. And so Windows isn't necessarily great with all the hardware support either. And really, is it a fair comparison, to really say the maturity of Linux versus Windows? Because we expect more out of Linux, because Linux is kind of everything. It's like every application that we use for the most part. We expect it to install and for it to generally work. I mean, yes, we do have to rely upon the developers of that application, but as far as how everything gets put together, is really on the distribution we use. So that's something that really Windows doesn't do. I mean, it kind of does now with the whole App Store thing, but I don't think most folks that use Windows, 90% plus of their applications come out of the App Store. They're installing it through, an external means, and that, of course, a lot of that comes from the difference in philosophy of like shared libraries and completely portable stuff that you see between Linux and Windows. But again, it's not quite 100% fair to just compare the stability of one to the other when the task of the one seems to be considerably greater. Well, there was something I want to comment on. Oh, someone mentioned the uptime of a device. We had a firewall in our environment. It was a Cisco Pix that had an uptime of close to 12 years when we shut it down, just because we had was an internal thing, and it wasn't something that we had physical access to. It resided in a data center in Plano that we never went to. So even though I'm sure it had some theoretical vulnerabilities, it wasn't exposed to the internet, so we didn't care that much. So we never updated it, and it survived for, like I said, close to 12 years before it went away. In the near future, I will be building a computer for the first time in a long time with my son. He wants a new gaming machine. He's graduating from UNCA this semester. Obviously it's Christmas as well. So, and it's his turn to get a new thing. So we're going to build. Of course, that's going to be a gaming machine on Windows, but it's still, it's still in our realm of computing. So it's probably going to be AMD across the board. But CPU, GPU, but I'm out of touch. So every time I do this, I have to sort of, because I'm not the type that's like always like the latest of this and the latest of that. And I'm not a hardware guy at work even now. There's big separation between me and the computing. So I don't really know what's out there until I have to go look for when, stuff like this comes around. So, yeah, and in case I don't say so later, happy holidays to all. And I don't know if we've talked the BIOS GPT MBR UEFI thing to death yet or not, but does anyone else have anything to do there?
Brent, I wanted to ask you a question in your territory. I on the GPT and all that other stuff, UEFI, that will always be with us for further discussion. But I wanted to ask Brent, what examples do you know of that you have heard of through the grapevine of corporate systems, in your case, healthcare, where they have actually been brave enough to get rid of their Windows machines at the personal computer level? You describe your experience with your headphones, and you basically were alluding to the fact that Linux appears to be as good a platform for the desktop user graphical environment. And let's face it, every user is basically using a browser for so many things. And it's only a handful of corporate people that are actually preparing like PowerPoint presentations or something that's dependent upon a an established Windows application or an established Apple application. So have you heard of any corporate environment that just took like 300 desktops and upgraded them by moving to Linux? That's my question.
I'm pretty insular, in what I do. Like I've tried many times to reach out to other organizations and say, hey, what are you doing? So I don't know what too many other people do, but I do know that in healthcare, there's still a big bias towards Windows. There's a lot of applications that only run on Windows. And there's a lot of expectations that the end user system is Windows. That being said, the device that some folks interfere with directly isn't necessarily a Windows system. It's often a thin client system that delivers to them a Windows desktop, which runs in a private cloud or something like that. That that is something we kind of sort of do to a limited extent where I work. We do use Citrix for virtual desktops, but we still by and large do have Windows systems for end users. I think change is coming in that regard, because to me it's like security has gotten so hard that we have to have a new paradigm on how we do things. Like we can't sort of have this the way that's going to come is some sort of containers, right? Because right now we have this computer that has the access to run this application that has, say, patient data in it, maybe indirectly or directly. And then we have this browser that has the ability to contact the internet or